This is exactly the types of details that we thought would come out, and these specific examples and reflection on how you're not able to see the outcomes that you want is very helpful.
Well, I do have a reaction to something that Steve and I think maybe Ann was getting at too, is that sometimes the condition of the roadway that would be the primary roadway is such that it's a pretty hostile environment. And I think land use and transportation issues have to be dealt with holistically because one relies on the other, and so some of what we can address in this project, while what we're addressing in this project is land use, right? The land use components of walkable design, we ought not lose sight of the fact that a lot of the ways our arterials, our primary streets, our design is not great for pedestrians. They're loud, they're smelly, they feel unsafe. So just acknowledging that's always going to be a conundrum when we're trying to kind of orient to the primary if the primary is no good.
Skylar, do you want to jump in?
Sure, and I'll be quick. I just want to echo what both Ann and Steve were saying. Particularly, I think Steve's point about clear and objective approaches to parking lot design are incredibly challenging, especially when it comes to the pedestrian walkway portion of it. Just navigating how that circulation works. But on the entry orientation thing, we see the same problems with we can require the entry, we can't require that they use it. It's often the same thing with glazing standards. And it seems like one of the things that maybe is missing or is a possibility for exploration is some entry quality standards. I think when the standard is just that you have an entry, it's sort of, there's a bare minimum approach that will be used. Things like recessed entryways, weather protection, other things that foster more pedestrian friendliness. I think even if the entryway is never used, at least from a pedestrian standpoint, it feels more like the building is not turning its back to you. And so I think what might be missing here is maybe it should be entry orientation and design standards, because I think we do want quality pedestrian focused entryways, even if they're not used.
Thanks, Skylar. Who was next here? Ray, did you have a point you wanted to jump in with as a follow-up item to any of this stuff?
I'm a bad cop today, keep in charge of time. So I wanted to sort of suggest we maybe take these other comments quickly and sort of flag entry orientation and parking lot design standards for some best practice research. It sounds like there's a lot more to talk about here.
Yeah, just for some context for the group. So we've asked her to help us identify items that we may need to utilize that one of the upcoming meetings to unpack and bring some best practice knowledge into the conversation as well. So I think to Ray's point, we've identified that entry orientation and pedestrian circulation within parking lots are areas that I think we've heard from the group. While you have standards, they may not be getting what you want. We may benefit from bringing some outside ideas in. So thanks, Ray. Phil?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, because whoops, turn my video back up. Kind of following up with some of the conversations with Albany and some of the other conversations. We've had provisions about transit street main entrance and also about parking lot location, and not only on corner lots but even on interior lots potentially. If somebody feels they have to provide parking, oftentimes what we'll see even on an interior lot is that the building will be oriented to the parking lot, and if it's a multi-tenant commercial building, sure, the front location will have their entrance face the front, but all the other buildings, all the other tenants will have their entrances face the parking lot, and essentially that the pedestrian traffic is coming from the parking lot to the units, and it's it's really hard to kind of come up with a design that gets away from that, as long as they're providing on-site parking. We've also had issues with the enforcement of that transit street main entrance. We do have something in our code that says it has to be open during business hours, but if they're not keeping that open, or if they find, because of security shoplifting issues, and the parking lot door and the street facing door are fairly far apart from, say, the cash registers, they tend to close the one facing the street, and then it becomes a code compliance issue, which isn't always something that rises to the top of enforcement, at least especially under the last couple of years. So it's one of those things where even when you have good rules, I think I'm just reiterating that a lot of times if somebody really wants to provide a building that orients to the parking lot, they tend to do that, and I don't know if there's a good solution to come up with that other than not having any parking.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I'll add one thought and move us along here, Phil. I think that, we're looking at one piece of CFEC, which is those walkable design standards, but there are the larger pieces of CFEC, which are looking at changing that parking, changing that transportation, looking at the streets and those bigger C shifts that are going to change how business is really done. So I'd like to move us on to some of these specific standards, and this is exactly the type of feedback we're looking for, so
Yes.
thank you. So, transparency standards, the intent of these standards is to create that safe, welcoming and interesting, frankly, pedestrian environment along that ground floor, really more in those mixed use or commercial districts. So we saw a range of these. These were arranged both in terms of how the number of districts where these were required, but also that actual dimensional range. So is that 50% of the ground floor is glazed up to 75%? Is that just commercial uses, or some codes also apply this to multi-unit buildings in more dense places? And so also we saw that some codes went a little bit further. They turned that dial up and they added in glazing requirements for upper floors, and also could add in an aspect about the dimensions, and so how those windows are oriented, and some more stringent design standards around that. So opening that up to the group, does anyone have any thoughts about this range of approaches and their reactions to it?
What's working well, what's working terribly, which of these are oftentimes have exceptions, requested or variances? What's your lived experience with glass on the front of buildings?
Skylar.
So I've already gone, so I'll be really super quick. And I mentioned this before. It's just like with the doors, you can require the glazing, but it doesn't mean that you're actually getting transparency, because we're not controlling the interiors. Like grocery stores will put in the glazing, and then they'll actually put coolers right in front of it. So what the pedestrian's seeing is the back of the cooler. So, I don't know how we get around that, because it's a tenancy-based issue that arises. But one of the things that we've looked at is is there a possibility to get like a minimum depth of visibility into the space, and still have that fly? I don't know, just asking the question.
Right. I think that's helpful, Skylar. Like, what is the intent here? Is it just to have glass, or is it to be able to have visibility into and out of the space?
Steve.
Just quickly echoing the same comment. I mean, I think that in the suburban context, stores will use the glazing like for additional signage space, where they'll basically kind of make de facto advertisement for the business rather than visibility in. And so I kind of agree with Skylar and wonder whether or not there's like, is there some kind of requirement like a depth, or like that it needs to either be like a display case or something, like an old fashioned, like, it needs to present something other than just advertisement or the back of something, or frosting, I don't know.
Brian, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, hi all. I put it in the chat, but I have a little bit of a different take on this. I think I think it's really important to have standards so that building is designed well, so people can really shine and use them well, and invite pedestrians in and have people looking in and seeing what's going on and what's for sale and all that stuff. But there's so many situations that I worry if we go too far, we're excluding people and getting in the way of what the business is trying to do. So there's a couple different examples. Like sometimes you end up with a medical facility or something that requires more privacy in a commercial area, which is it attracts traffic. It's a fine business, but they can't have folks looking way into their building. They're going to need it to be screened. And so you're not going to have exciting things in the front. There's also different cultural communities have different ways they advertise and invite their customers in. So you might see a grocery store that's looking, targeting a Latino audience, wanting to cover the windows with advertisements. We actually reduced our percentage of transparency requirement in downtown to try to let people do more ads on the inside of their windows for that reason. So we didn't exclude people. So I think that I'm in the design and hope category actually, but I could be in the minority. I just wanted to share those different situations. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Those are really helpful thoughts. I'm curious, what does the group think in terms of the applicability within different place types? And also that question of that upper floors, how to meet those CFEC intents, how far does this standard need to be dialed?
Is it primarily ground floor consideration for pedestrians, or does it need to extend beyond that to meet our, the intent of any of our evaluation criteria? Anyone wrestled with that question about how far to dial this standard up the side of a building?
Phil.
I think, and just in response, I mean, on our ground floor, we sort of have two sets of standards like you're showing. And our ground floor standards kind of vary depending on if it's just something in the base commercial zone or if it's in like a main street overlay where we go up higher. We do have upper floor glazing requirements in some of our codes. I think they are beneficial. The idea is potentially, especially when you're talking about office and or residential, it still provides an eyes on the street opportunity from the upper floors. In some cases we have 30% glazing requirements. In other cases, it's the upper floors are similar to some of the provisions we have even in our single dwelling zones. So I think we have a greater range on that. The thing that we've grappled with, and we end up creating some specific standards, was qualifying what the ground floor is. And so at least for our ground floor base zone standards, we actually created an area of between 2 and 10 feet above the adjoining sidewalk grade, because we were having situations where if a building, especially it's on a corner and on one side it's relatively flat, but say the street slopes down on the other side, at what point was that ground floor not really a ground floor, and at what point did maybe the basement area become the ground floor? So we actually had to create some additional parameters around what the ground floor was, and that has become a bigger issue with some of our other standards, because we did that for the windows but not for some other things.
Great. Okay, Paige, and then we're going to move on to the next topic. And maybe you can drop what you're thinking in the chat. Paige, go ahead.
Oh, lose you, Paige?
Sorry, there we go. I just want to take a step back and think about what the purpose is of glazing windows, transparency, being able to see in, see out. I mean, really, it's often a perception for people walking, for pedestrians to feel safer, or to feel like they're being invited into a space like a store, or a business. But it really comes down to the perception of how safe and comfortable you feel on the sidewalk. And so I think it's interesting that we've really like applied math to how much glazing needs to be on the outside. But I think, you know, if you just have a whole block of windows and there's no door or access to be able to slip into a place if you are uncomfortable, or know that someone could come to your rescue if you're feeling like there's a situation that might happen, it appears to me that an entryway and access points, and to Skylar's a very good observation, the design standards for making sure that a pedestrian knows and can very easily spot what an access is into or out of a building, I think is important here. But yeah, I wanted to just kind of take a step back because we're talking really specifically about percentages, but with pedestrian livability and attractiveness to being in a pedestrian oriented area, a lot of this is just perception about your safety. And so, you know, that's one thing I wanted to bring up. The other is, I'm not sure where awnings are coming into this. I often see awnings just on the outside of windows. But I know that when we're establishing a transit area or shelter and we think that it might be a high use area, we do tend to look for places where there are awnings where people can duck out of the rain or the sun without having to be all cramped up inside of one of our small shelters, because typically a transit stop will have a small shelter compared to the activity. In, I would imagine, these climate friendly areas, we're going to see high passenger activity. And so just, I don't know where that fits with awnings, but it seems like because we're talking about glazing, I would bring it up.
Great, thanks, Paige. I really appreciate keeping us at that high level and reminding us what is the intent of these standards. And we inevitably will dive into some of the details, but you're right. What's the bigger picture? How are we encouraging that true pedestrian orientation to improve use? So totally different approach, tactic, topic now, which is drive-through design standards. So I do want to remind the group that we're not looking specifically at the permission of uses. So in which place type should this use be permitted or not? We're purely looking at the design standards aspect. So on one end of the spectrum, we have jurisdictions that regulate drive-through standards purely using their build to line. So requiring that drive-through, the building to come up to the front of the lot line so that it's more oriented to the street, so that somebody walking by is not walking through a parking lot and having those conflict points with vehicles. Now, the option B, going a little bit further, would be looking at more of those conflict points to make sure that a pedestrian feels safe in approaching this. So making sure there's adequate stacking lanes so that there's not those cars sitting across the driveway, that there's enough space from the intersection so that we're not having a lot of cars coming into that space, again, conflict points. And then providing some pedestrian service access points. A good example of this would be in the bottom right-hand corner. This, what I call the Deluxe Dutch Brothers in Philomath, would be an example of a really pedestrian-oriented drive-through business. So where do people fall on this? Is there a need to turn the dial to that option B? Or have people felt that an option A would serve their outcomes as well?
And if anyone wants to advocate for their own, you know, jurisdiction's approach, if you think it's working really well, that kind of feedback is helpful too, even if it's not a specific standard. Or poorly, also. This is every planner's favorite topic, is how to regulate Dutch Brother traffic coming and going. Anyone have any experiences on this front, good, bad, or ugly. We can certainly move to the next topic since we are a little behind, but.
Okay, well, if you have thoughts on,
Oh, Steve.
Steve, thank you.
Just a quick one, because I mean, I think this site kind of actually lends itself really well to a drive-through overall. And I worked with a Black Rock Coffee previously where the site was a little funkier. It was like almost like a subdivision of drive-throughs, if you can believe it. And I think that just making sure that there is the requirement of some like walk-up window or pedestrian access period is probably the key thing that I would want to see included.
Great. Okay. Okay, I will keep us moving along. Similar to transparency, there's a really technical math on the screen. So keeping us, I think, Paige, as you reminded us, bigger picture, this build to line standard is looking at creating, incrementally with infill, a street wall, bringing buildings up to the front of this sidewalk in order to make sure that there's an interesting street wall, framing that space for pedestrians. This is also highly interrelated with that parking orientation standard, right? In order to bring that building up to the front of the lot line, the parking inevitably is behind or to the side. So I think our primary questions here are place type oriented. Which place types do we feel that a build to line standard is appropriate? Is this something that responds to that OAR 0330 goal of the street environment in residential districts? Or is this purely in the realm of those commercial place types that we were looking at? And also, what is that maximum setback? And if anyone has any thoughts on specific dimensional standards, I would agree here that it's really important to have a list of pedestrian amenities if we are going to have that larger setback to really encourage and make clear that pedestrians can use that space that's in that larger setback. So I'm going to throw this one out to the group.
You can see the range is quite big for the amount of building that needs to be pulled up to the front. It's 50 to 75. I mean, there's some pretty functional differences and experiential differences there. So trying to get a handle on what has struck the balance of pedestrian orientation while also, being feasible in a neighborhood Main Street context, for instance, that is caters to walkers and bikers, but also folks who are parking.
Ryan.
Hi, yeah, we have what we call frontage occupation standards in we have some new commercial mixed use zones that are commercial zones where we have something like this where we require 70% of a building or another active space, so like a plaza or a public park, or we even allow outdoor seating that's associated with an interior use, so like restaurant seating to count toward that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a building facade within that. We're thinking about other kinds of activity that would interact with the public realm. One place where we found this challenging, and it's pretty new zones, we haven't been able to apply it too much, but one thing that has been a little bit challenging is properties where there are existing buildings and they want to add to that building, and thinking about nonconformities and if there's already a building that's set back beyond that maximum setback, are they allowed to add to that building, or do they need to build a new building in the front that fully complies with our frontage occupation standard before they can touch that building in the back? So thinking about nonconformities has been something that we've kind of struggled with.
Skylar.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to the design thing with the entrance standards too. I think it's uh, from our perspective, it's less about how much of the building is within that maximum setback and more about what's going on in the portion that's not within the maximum setback. So what's the activity or the design in the portion that's further back from the street, and is that pedestrian friendly? So I think maybe something to consider is like if you know for the portion of the building that's not within the maximum setback, what are the allowable design options available to make that pedestrian friendly?
So the chat function, if you're kind of need some narrowly focused feedback or have a technical question, that's fine. But if there's a question, like I can't see the chat right now. So if there's a question you think would benefit the group, feel free to just chime in, raise your hand. Chances are if you've got that question, other people do too. We have Tara and Ray monitoring the chat. So Tara, Ray, if you see anything, or Jamin, if you see anything that we need to daylight, please let us do that. Brian?
Yeah, my head's spinning on this one. This one gets complicated really fast. There's so many lot widths and context. I won't go there, but I think you all know. One thing that occurs to me though is automatically when you're saying the parking is going to be in the side and the back, especially in areas where you would expect more parking to be provided, even if it's not required, that percentage is going to go down dramatically, especially the side parking. So having really high expectations for both is not going to work. And what we've had to do is kind of, because we have to have clear and objective standards, we have to write like, we'd like this and this. But then what happens if you can't do them? Or what's the trigger for it going down if you're doing parking, or then if you're on the corner or you have a 3 or 4 sided block with one development, building in reductions in the percentage for folks who have multiple frontages because you can't meet it on all. So it takes a lot of writing to get there, and then you have to have a discretionary path because you just can't anticipate everything. So this is a tricky one, but I think as far as the context goes, that number is going to have to drop significantly on kind of your busier corridors, and you want to save the higher percentages for the areas that have more hope to be, more walkable, mixed use, fine-grained areas.
Thanks. Paige?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One, I think this is very tied to what happens with the right of way and the cross section proposed in these areas. And I mean, obviously we're doing TSP updates, but I think even those TSP updates are going to be outdated within, 10 years, possibly 15 years with our CFAs. So this kind of goes back to the level of service issue that I brought up in the last meeting, in that we really aren't modeling in a very good way what the pedestrian demand or bicycle demand is going to be. So on this corridor, for example, if this was a corridor that was facing this building and we had in our TSP that, a standard, let's say 10-foot sidewalk was needed, and the building was able to build all the way up to that 10 feet, that doesn't really take into account the possibility in the future we might want to actually make it 15 feet. So are we now building into the road, or are we going to tear down the building? And this is something that, a lot of cities deal with every day, with trying to figure out how to do complete streets projects, and you can't move the building, and so you end up narrowing the lanes or removing lanes. And so I think, I guess in this way, I would be more of an advocate to be less you know, will have, I guess, have a really good maximum setback that allows for that functionality in the future to be built into the street system. More, of course, directed for pedestrian and bicycle facilities. But I would be very, very cautious about trying to encourage buildings to build right up to an existing street when that street cross section could change drastically in the next, 20 years. The second thought is for transit. We struggle a lot when there's a zero setback or even just a small setback behind the sidewalk, because now we have no place to put a transit facility, a shelter in particular, which requires 8 feet depth, and that 8 feet's a lot. So having that 8 feet span the entire distance of the building would be kind of crazy, but having it staggered so that you do have at least some space to put transit facilities would be, I think great. And then if we need to look at more specific locations, we tend to like to stop on the far side of the intersection, not on the near side. For those of you who are not familiar with transit, we don't necessarily want to stop and then have to stop again at the intersection. And so we like to have our bus stops on the far sides of intersections. So I'm not sure if we can even get as granular in this to say, well, for buildings that are on the far sides of intersection and on the corner, they would have, a greater setback than those that are, maybe mid-block where transit, likely a bus isn't going to be stopping mid-block. So I think that there are some variabilities there with depending on, where that building is. And especially thinking of corners, often your plazas, your pedestrian plazas and your locations of, wayfinding and whatnot are also on corners. So if there's a way to think of buildings that are on corners to maybe have a maximum setback, I think that gives us a lot of flexibility in the future to build more pedestrian oriented design features.
Yeah, this is good feedback.
Okay, we're gonna dive into our next priority topic and keep moving. Again, connectivity. So this question of connections between uses, destinations, how to make it easier and more comfortable for all types of users to move through sites, through districts. And so
Go ahead.
this is the list of standards. So similarly, we have public access way and mid-block connections, dead end street length or spacing, which is really more geared toward limiting those, and then also limits on cul-de-sacs. And in that, sometimes in varied range, we have the street connectivity standards and block length and perimeter length standards. And so pausing on these green standards, does the group have any thoughts about what is working well right now or challenges that you all are seeing with these standards?
I think we heard a little bit of feedback earlier on the mid-block connections or even sort of the mid-project connections. If there's a row of retailers in an area that's not, solidly, pedestrian oriented today, those can be a tactic to allow for the flow of folks from a rear side parking area to the front doors. It's a commonly used tactic, and without those, it just sort of makes the travel distance from the parking lot around to an inline retailer difficult. So like all of this are a little related, but I don't know if anyone has any lived experience on the mid-block connections and success utilizing those kind of standards to more effectively orient the primary entrances on the primary street, even though people are parking in the rear or the side. Is that a critical ingredient? And you have a comment there. Feel free to just hop in to the conversation too, if it's worth mentioning.
Well, we don't have any of those standards. That's all I was saying. So okay. We don't have. No.
Does it seem like having those kind of standards would help to resolve some of the challenges around people parking in the rear but needing to enter in the front? Is that related in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think any standards that help. Yeah, I mean, we just have downtown, and then we have, suburban commercial. So we don't have like these standard blocks really, except for in downtown, and those are walkable blocks. So it just hasn't been applicable. So I think it'll be important that we have standards when we're looking at trying to create those, walkable blocks or connections in our climate friendly areas and areas that we're proposing to be climate friendly that are actually more of your suburban commercial, but that we want to over time, grow up into a pedestrian friendly mixed use area.
Yep. Skylar?
So we have mid-block connection standards for pedestrian connectivity. If a street cannot be connected, does work reasonably well in greenfield development areas, larger subdivisions. Becomes challenging in redevelopment scenarios because you may not get the other side of the connection. Sometimes, depending on the scale of the development, there are rough proportionality issues that arise, and so I'd be interested in seeing best practices around getting those connections, maybe through incentives or something, in those very, sort of unique redevelopment scenarios that we're likely to see in CFAs, which are probably all going to be our highly developed areas already.
So sort of how you incrementally add these mid-block connections into an existing context.
Yes, and how you might creatively use incentives to get those rather than requiring dedication, because again, sometimes because you've got other things that are being required to be dedicated, you run into rough proportionality for smaller redevelopments. Yeah.
Okay.
So some sort of trade-off, public benefit for flexibility or something like that.
Right. Good thought. Phil, and then we'll move to the orange topics. Phil?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to clarify when you're talking about public access way mid-block connections. Example you were kind of talking about was, a walkway or something to access a building in the back. I mean, we have good pedestrian standard requirements for a site if it's, all part of the same site, where if there's pad buildings in the front, but a larger building in the back, where we're getting pedestrian network that, orients or creates a connection between the street and say that building in the back. But kind of echoing Skylar's piece, unless it's a greenfield site, we don't really have the way to kind of force a connection to access another site on a existing modification to a site, unless it's like a complete redevelopment of the site. And it's also very hard to know, where should that connection necessarily go if you don't know what the other development is expected on the other site. So we have, street network requirements for land divisions and things like that when they're dividing land, but not necessarily within a commercial site that's accessing another commercial site.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely, Phil. And that's a lot of the types of issues we were also looking, very interrelated in terms of the street connections. So there's those mid-block connections in larger sites, larger blocks, but also then where are those street connections being made? We can see in the example on the left, this is what we're trying to avoid. Someone's moving through a neighborhood or a district, and they'd like to walk or bike somewhere, but they hit another street pattern that forces them onto these larger, less pedestrian-oriented arterials. So on one end of the spectrum, there's requiring new streets to connect to existing proposed or planned streets. So this is predicated on the fact that you have a TSP or a comprehensive plan or some other form of plan that notes those future connections that are prioritized. And then I think going above and beyond just connecting the streets is connecting those streets and orienting them to both existing or planned other destinations. So those would be key destinations such as parks, shopping areas, transit stops, and employment centers. So I'm really interested to hear from the group's perspective if this option B is something that's been feasible, or if there's also been challenges in terms of applying this with clear and objective. You know, how easy is a standard like that to administer, and are you getting good results?
Seems like an easy one, Pauline. I guess we gotta move on. No, this one's probably, I mean, all these are fairly complicated, but how you plan for the evolution of a place and its interconnectedness is really challenging. Kevin, you have a thought?
I'll just note that I know in at least one city I've worked in, fire department requirements have had an impact on reducing dead-end streets. I think, and Ryan will know if I'm right in remembering this, I think there used to be a standard where they would say no more than 18 residential units off a cul-de-sac or a single access street. I don't know if that's common in other cities, if that's a phenomenon that people are dealing with, but I'd be curious to hear about it.
Anyone have any experiences, good, bad, or ugly, on administering street connectivity standards? Steve?
I have a little bit of experience. I worked previously in Happy Valley, and so it was very topographically challenged, and so that was certainly a big factor in it. I guess just maybe trying to better understand the options. Is option B suggesting like actually creating a significant amount of offsite improvement? Because I think my antenna kind of go up there, like thinking about proportionality and nexus for development. Like how a city would have to come to the table with money to make that option work. I guess I'll say I'm more familiar with option A, whereas option B feels like maybe a great aspiration, but I don't know really how realistic or feasible it is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the limitations that, you know, in addition to it not being a clear and objective standard in some cases, that's one of the limitations that we, you know is challenging with that kind of standard where the criteria is connect to some other destination, which may not be actually another street that's been either is existing street or is something that's planned. So yeah, I think that was our expectation that proportionality would become more of a challenge in that case, because you're starting to require more maybe than seems directly proportional to the impacts of the development.
Well, I think the consideration, I mean, the distinction I would offer is like, are you trying to connect for immediate adjacency, right? Without sort of zooming out and understanding the context and of the place and like what might be the highest priority direction to move or to connect, based on the activity or the use a few lots away or even further than that. So like, how much is the context and the surrounding activity a way to prioritize the direction or nature of the connections?
I think that's a good question. One thing I would maybe add additionally is that in something like a tool that we use to deploy was a requirement for development to provide like basically a conceptual street connectivity plan that went beyond the property like a certain distance. And so, and then, that basically didn't necessarily require the development or the developer itself to come to the table with all of those developments, but at least required them to show, say within, 1,500 feet, or it could be a half mile in this example, where demonstrating what it would take. Because I mean, in a lot of cases, like you're talking about, like it could even be just like an abutting piece of property that needs to be a take or a purchase, you know, to accomplish the connection. So some of these like final steps are actually really, really hard to take. And so I feel like just knowing what the landscape looks like is really the important thing, and kind of forcing development to at least like look at it and then to go from there maybe. And that's where you can leverage the clear and objective standards and say, hey, well, you've shown this connectivity plan within a half mile of your site, and here's what your site needs to do in order to meet those standards and ensure that the standards will be continually met as this area develops in the future or as we bridge these gaps.
Yeah. Yep, I like that approach, sort of forcing an exercise that hopefully influences the design of one site, but yeah.
Quick like question, are any of your jurisdictions that do not have TSPs that have some form of a street connectivity plan in it? I would assume that, you know, something like that development, specific street connectivity plan will kind of fill in the gap between your TSP and that specific development. But how common is it to not have a street connectivity plan that you can rely on to then require development to make those connections? Go ahead, Brian.
My answer to your question is yes and no, both. Because
excellent.
For the city, there's a bunch of local connectivity maps in the transportation system plan that have like arrows doing this, where there's future connections indicated. But we're doing the Cooper Mountain Community Plan right now for a 1,200 acre urban boundary expansion area, and it's impossible to do that. We have the desired locations for collectors and neighborhood routes, but it's empty and there's a bunch of streams and hills and natural resources, and 160 different properties. So there's no way to make, I mean, I guess there is a way if you want to like do that, but like there is no really affordable, feasible way to do that, given we didn't want to master plan the whole area. We don't have access to the sites. We don't have the money to do all the engineering to figure all that out. So it's going to have to be both for us. It's not going to be possible to get that fine grain in every situation, I don't think.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna keep us moving here.
Steve,
Sorry, Steve, do you have one more thought to add to that?
Just quickly, I would just add that like we have like arterial and collector street plans, but we've actually like moved away pretty significantly from local street connectivity plans and more so we just have found that they end up getting redesigned so much anyway, and that we've more so focused on the clear and objective standards of like block length and connectivity requirements, and then let them happen more organically.
Thanks for teeing up the next topic, Steve. I really appreciate that. I think this is exactly this question of other ways to get at connectivity, which is setting a length and perimeter standard for that block size. So really moving toward more network connectivity by having those smaller blocks, so there's more connections available. So I just want to point out that 0330 is pretty broad on this. It just requires some form of these standards be put in place to provide for network connectivity. But then when we look specifically within the CFA relevant OARs, there are some specific numbers. And so we wanted to daylight that and get a sense from the group in terms of, to me, this raises a question of threshold and intent. Again, you know, as Patricia reminds us, what is the intent here? So 0320 is looking at larger sites should be broken up into smaller blocks. That seems to be the guiding intent here. When we looked at a lot of jurisdictions do have these block length standards, but the threshold for applying them or how they're actually applied is quite different. So it could be applied to all new streets. It could be applied only to blocks with a certain specific street classification. So that taking into account, you know, those larger arterial or connecting streets may have larger blocks on them, and that's around spacing and traffic and safety concerns. It may only apply to larger sites, so that total acreage of site. Or it may be that it is only used in specific zones, so really targeted, let's say, to your downtown areas where you want that fine grained network. So given this huge range of ways that this is applied, I'm sort of interested from hearing from the group, is there something that jumps out? Should block standards vary based on use types? I think we can agree that street and street functionality definitely has an impact, you know, but should something along the lines on the right-hand side, where there's these large blocks in downtown Beaverton, is a 740-foot block length in a certain place type meeting that pedestrian connection? This is also really interrelated with mid-block. So tons of issues with this standard, and I think I'm just wondering if the group has any thoughts that you want to share on block length. I think we'll definitely come back to the group with more recommendations and thoughts around this, but anyone top of mind thoughts? Yes, Anne.
Yeah, thank you. I just put something in the chat, and I was thinking about the mid block, but I think it's, if we're thinking about blocks, it'd be nice if we could break blocks up with just a pedestrian bicycle corridor and not have to have it be vehicular access, because I can see moving away from the downtown even, and we want mixed use multi-story buildings and all that, but I think that in our more suburban areas, it will be challenging, and you know, right of way can just be a lot of land that ends up not being utilized for buildings, that we allow blocks to be broken up with the ped bike corridors, and maybe there's a maximum where you can do that. And the idea came from Corvallis's code when Ryan mentioned this maybe at our first meeting, or we were researching block lengths. They allow, they now went to a longer block length, but require a pedestrian bike corridor through. And it just seems to make a lot more sense to me in the expensive right of way and the use of the land, where you want as many active uses. And another thing I mentioned, which is sort of related to orientation, but could also be related to this, is we want our climate-friendly areas in a perfect world to have gathering spaces or public spaces that people would be in, and not necessarily just along the street frontage and your cafes along the street frontage and your tables out there where it might be noisy or whatever, but you might have those internal to the development. And these, like, they could be right-of-ways or whatever they're called, might be places where you have buildings oriented to, because those are providing the things that we like about these mixed-use areas, and places to gather and get outside and do all that. So I used to be a big fan of having the blocks, and I love being able to walk around downtown, but you do have to cross the street and worry about traffic and all that. So if we could think of non-vehicle corridors counting towards it, that'd be my recommendation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great thought to throw out. Not every passageway has to serve every user all the time. I think that's great.
It's also helpful to respond to that infill context and redevelopment. So there's existing large blocks, and how can we move or adapt those without putting a full, you know, right of way through them. Ryan, do you have any thoughts to share?
Yeah, thanks, Anne, for teeing me up. Yeah, you covered most of what I was going to say. And I just wanted to note that the latest version of the CFA methods guide actually has a tip that the OAR 320 subsection 5 doesn't specify how to define block length. And so it does give us some discretion at the local level to determine how we want to define that. If we want to define that as a vehicle, as vehicular circulation, or if we want to define that as something else, I think we have the discretion to do that.
Skylar?
I'm kind of curious, going back to your previous slide, exactly how you would vary block length by street classification.
I'm trying to remember, I'm trying to remember which city does this. I think it's Springfield. I would put them on the spot to explain that. So it's really more, we just inventoried it.
I get, yeah. If I'll let them respond. I guess within CFAs, and I realize this gets out maybe outside of, we're focused on land use here, but just a comment about street classification in CFAs. I recognize that something might be classified as an arterial, but I think for the thing, zooming out, taking that big picture of what we're trying to achieve here, I think it's maybe important to consider that arterials should not look functionally different from local streets within CFAs. And that maybe that sort of moots the question of whether you vary the block length based on those street classifications. I guess where I could see it coming in is if you had something that's sort of what Ian was talking about, like maybe ped connections, or maybe it's something in between where it's more like a shared street, VUNERF kind of thing. But to me, an arterial moving through a CFA should just, I shouldn't be able to tell, right? That's like one of the issues that we have with orphan highways in a lot of our CFA areas.
Yep, you can sure tell today. Good point. Steve?
I guess just to maybe clarify that point and bring in some of the other comments before, which I enjoyed. I mean, you still would have like intersection spacing standards, which to some extent are going to trump block length. So if you have a lesser block length standard, but you have a greater intersection spacing standard for an arterial, you're going to end up with a like de facto sliding scale of these anyway, I would think. And then I guess I would also just echo and appreciate the comment about like bikeway and pedestrian standards as like being a supplement for like strict, especially for maybe strict adherence to block length standards. I feel like in Happy Valley, that was a way that we really used in a positive way, like issues meeting some of these standards, but insisting on having bike ped connections and throughways in place of that was really powerful. And I think that just keeping in mind the purpose of this CFA and thinking about that idea that I think it was Anne mentioned about like the wasted right of way, like it not being utilized all the time and not being a great use of it, and just making sure that we consider that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Paige?
Yeah, so I really do appreciate street classification, but maybe not to the extreme of having a, even a minor arterial. But I think that when we were moving through this on the rack and looking at block lengths and pedestrian connectivity, I was definitely apprehensive about the idea of there being a pedestrian, not necessarily connection, but connection can sometimes mean crossing when you're a pedestrian. Even if you don't have a protected crossing, you might decide to cross anyway. Having a very large transit vehicle that is traveling down these streets and constantly having to navigate pedestrian activity is very stressful. And for, a car driver, you might only visit that location once a week, theoretically, but as a bus driver, you might be there every 10 or 20 minutes. So there's a lot of risk there if there's a high amount of pedestrian activity or crossings or blocks that allow for crossings on a corridor that would potentially be a transit corridor. I don't believe that these CFAs are going to have buses on every single street, no matter the direction. There will likely be certain streets that are more accommodating to having transit than others, and that's where we're going to gravitate to. Also, we are in a lot of these areas already. We have already established our routes in these CFA areas that are being designated. And it's not easy to change a transit route. We can change them, but it's not easy to. And we've put a lot of thought into why we are deciding to go down the existing streets that we are. And so knowing that, and also that we, as a transit operation, we typically stop in a high density urban area about every 1/8 of a mile. So having something that's going to be available on, say, a transit boulevard, let's call it, as a street classification, that would be awesome if we could identify that in a TSP. That has minimal pedestrian, has limited, that block length, so that we can get from our stop to stop, get through the lights, and pick up and drop where our bus stops are. That's what we would prefer. As a pedestrian, you're going to go to the areas where people are walking, and there's going to be a lot of those opportunities in these CFAs. But I think that we need to be really careful about having so much pedestrian activity in the entire area that it's a conflict for transit. It's a conflict for bicyclists, right? There's a lot of balancing that we have to do. And so I think that there are appropriate places to have smaller block lengths. And I would, see that there's areas where that's not appropriate to have lots of pedestrian crossings, or the opportunity for a pedestrian to cross in an unprotected fashion.
So I think we're gonna have to leave it there, given time. Phil and Brian, if you don't mind holding on to your comments for now. And I do just want to remind the bigger group that, mostly the walkable design standards input that we'll be providing through this project is the areas outside the CFAs, because those have their own standards.
But these will apply to the entire
city, that's right. So in the interest of time, again, this is all an incredibly interesting discussion. I'm just going to share the inventory slides for the last 2 topics to get some thoughts high level before we provide some next steps. So in terms of looking at access and circulation, in terms of those access points and safety and concerns and minimizing that conflict, really similar to the topic that Paige was just bringing up. Here's the set of standards that we're currently looking at. And that often and similar is shared access, minimum bike parking design standards. In the sometimes and varied, there's alley access. So a lot of that is issues in terms of how far to go in terms of encouraging versus requiring certain uses or certain place types to take access off an alley. And then minimum driveway spacing standards. This is primarily in the residential context. Are we requiring a minimum driveway spacing? And then rare and specific is long-term bicycle parking. So I would ask the group if anyone has any thoughts on these standards, things that are currently maybe not working well for you that you'd like to raise for the group.
With maybe a little bit of a nudge towards, how's the application of alleyway standards and sort of the related, front driveway spacing standards. If you have alleys, then you have less need for front driveway standard. You may be able to get rid of them. So those 2 issues are kind of tangled up. Some places just wishfully think encourage those, and then some places require. And I don't know if people have run into good outcomes or challenging outcomes.
Okay, we'll move on to the next inventory for the next topic. And you'll have access to all these slides. So in the transit and multi-mobility amenities, we saw actually not a lot of often and similar approaches, but really there was a range in terms of the requirement to provide transit facilities. This is often a question of the threshold, what size project, more than what those facilities are, which size or which types of projects should provide those. transit pedestrian connections and transit oriented entrance standards. Those were really also a matter of threshold again, and also clear and objective. So what types of pedestrian connections, what size of project? And I think we raised also a lot of these concerns early on in the discussion. Does anyone have any thoughts to share on these? Okay, so
we have one whole minute, but just to kind of calm everyone's nerves, you're gonna get a copy of these slides and be able to leave comments, and we'll take them in writing or in the slides themselves. Our hope is that we can leverage, you know, the ability of the hyperlinks to these Google slides as a way to allow you to comment directly on the slides. But if you have challenges with that, let us know, and you can provide them in writing. In fact, while we were talking, we got some comments, so.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, really appreciate all your input as people who use these standards or work alongside closely with people who work the desk and understand exactly what are the issues that come up with your current approaches to standards. Covered an enormous amount of content. So we're providing those slides, and if you have any trouble accessing those slides, but we do appreciate you taking some time to share additional thoughts with us. And you know, every comment has some really interesting and great considerations. The more you comment, the better guidance we can provide in our recommendations long term. So we're giving 1 week. Of course, if you need more time, let us know. And then otherwise, we're targeting that last week of May to come back and have this discussion with you all around issues of compact development. So you can expect a meeting invite and materials coming through Cody. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for sticking with us on a really deep dive here on all things code. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, look forward to any follow-up comments and thoughts you have. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.